Cairo, 1896. A man walks through a market and buys an old manuscript. He is not a treasure hunter. He is not on a mission. He is a scholar named Karl Reinhardt, or doing what scholars do in markets like this one, looking at old things and deciding which ones matter. This one is written in Coptic. The pages are fragile. Some of them are missing. Gone before he ever touched it. Gone before anyone now alive was born. He wraps it carefully and takes it to Berlin. And then, something happens that no one planned. Nothing. The manuscript sits. Years pass. Scholars examine it. Argue over it. Begin to prepare it for publication. Then the First War comes. Then the Second. Then the slow, exhausted work of rebuilding a continent that had torn itself apart twice in 30 years. The manuscript waits through all of it, sitting in a research institute in Berlin, neither hidden nor forgotten, just delayed the way ancient things so often are, by scholarship and war, and the simple fact that the world keeps interrupting itself. 1955. 59 years after Karl Reinhardt carried it out of that Cairo market. The manuscript is finally published. When scholars read what is inside, they find a name on the cover. The name is Mary. And the question that name forces is not the one most people expect. It is not what secret does this reveal. It is something quieter than that. And, in the end, much harder to answer. What did the people who wrote this remember about her? And why did they remember her so differently from everything else that survived? Chapter 1. The Women at the Tomb. Start with a question that almost no one thinks to ask. Not who was Mary Magdalene. Not what did she believe. Not whether the stories about her are true. Something more specific than any of that. On the morning that changed everything. According to the tradition that built the largest religious institution in human history, who was actually there? Not in the theology, in the text, name by name, gospel by gospel, who showed up. Because the answer is not what most people have been told, and it has been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years. The Gospel of Matthew says 2 women came to the tomb that morning. Mary Magdalene, and the other Mary. The Gospel of Mark says 3. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. The Gospel of Luke says more than that. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James. And then, almost as an afterthought, a phrase that has been passed over so many times it barely registers anymore. And the other women with them. Other women. Unnamed. Present. Forgotten before the sentence even ends. The Gospel of John says something different from all 3. No group. No list. Just one person. Standing alone outside the tomb in the early morning dark. Mary Magdalene. Now, here is what is remarkable about those 4 accounts. They disagree on almost everything. How many women came? Which women came? What they saw when they arrived? What they were told? What they did next? If you sit down and try to reconcile the 4 versions into a single coherent timeline, you will not succeed. Scholars have been trying for centuries. But there is one thing all 4 accounts agree on. Without exception. Without variation. Across every version of the story. Mary Magdalene was there. She is the only figure, male or female, present in all 4 resurrection narratives. Not Peter, not the disciple traditionally identified as John, not any of the 12 who had walked with Jesus for years. Just this woman, whose name the Gospels give us without explanation, without biography, almost without introduction. She was already there before anyone thought to ask who she was. Now, look more carefully at what the Gospel of John does with her. After the other disciples arrive at the tomb, look inside, and leave. Mary stays. She is standing outside, crying. She looks into the tomb and sees two figures sitting where the body had been. She turns around. There is a man standing near her. She does not recognize him. She assumes he is the gardener. He says one word. Her name. She turns. She recognizes him. And then comes the instruction that will matter more than almost anything else in this story. Go. Go and tell. In Greek, the word for someone sent to deliver a message is apostolos. It is where the English word apostle comes from. It does not describe a rank or a title in these early texts. It describes an action. Someone given a message and sent to deliver it to others who have not yet heard it. In this moment, in the gospel that the tradition has always placed, last and deepest, Mary Magdalene is sent. She carries what she has seen to people who were not there to see it. She goes and tells. The text does not make a speech about this. It does not pause to note the significance of what just happened. It simply records it. The way the Gospels record most things. Without commentary. Without fanfare. As if it were obvious. She was sent. She went. She told. Before anyone called her anything, the Gospel had already described the action that the title would later try to name. But go back to those other names for a moment. Joanna, Salome, the other women with them. Joanna is not a minor figure in Luke's account. She appears earlier in the same Gospel as a woman of some means who had supported Jesus and his followers. She is named. She is present at the tomb. And then, in the long memory of the tradition, she is almost entirely gone. Salome appears in Mark, and then nowhere else in the canonical Gospels. She was there on the most important morning in the tradition's history, and the tradition kept almost nothing of her. The other women. They do not even get names. This is not a small thing. It is worth sitting with before we go any further. Because here is what it tells us about how memory works. Religious memory. Historical memory. Any memory at all. Every act of remembering is also an act of choosing. You cannot remember everything. You cannot keep everyone. Something gets carried forward, and something gets left behind. And the things that get left behind are not always the least important things. Sometimes they are simply the things that no tradition, in the centuries that followed, felt the particular need to carry. Mary Magdalene was carried. Joanna was not. Salome was not. The other women were not. And here is the question that will follow us through everything that comes next. If even the act of recovering Mary Magdalene, of bringing her back to the center of the story, where the texts already placed her, still leaves Joanna and Salome and the unnamed others in the shadows, what does that tell us about the limits of recovery itself? We remember one woman and call it justice. But the tomb that morning was not empty of witnesses. It was full of them. That question has no clean answer. We will come back to it. For now, stay with Mary. Stay with the text. Because before we look at what happened to her memory over the centuries that followed, we need to understand something that is easy to miss. She did not need any other gospel to make her important. She was already at the center of the story the tradition chose to keep. The question is not how she got there. The question is what happened next. Chapter 2. The Apostle to the Apostles. There is a title that has followed Mary Magdalene through 2,000 years of Christian history. Most people have never heard it. Not because it was invented recently. Not because it comes from a text outside the tradition. It comes from inside the church itself. From writers who were building the very institution that would later seem to have forgotten it. And it is old enough that the men who first used it did not think of it as controversial or in need of explanation. They read the gospel. They saw what happened at the tomb. And they reached for the most accurate description they had. Apostola apostolorum. The apostle to the apostles. Think about what that phrase actually means when you hold it next to what the Gospel describes. The apostles, the ones traditionally numbered among the 12, had not been there. They had not seen the empty tomb first. They had not received the instruction to go and tell. That instruction went to Mary, which means that when she arrived to deliver her message, she was bringing to the apostles something they did not yet have. She was, in the most literal sense, the word allows, sent to them. The title is not an honorary one invented to make a woman feel included. It is a description of a sequence of events that the Gospels themselves record. Among the early Christian writers known to have reflected on this role explicitly is Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the 3rd century. In his commentary on the Song of Songs, Hippolytus connected Mary Magdalene's role at the resurrection directly to the idea of being sent, of carrying what she had witnessed to those who had not witnessed it. He was not a radical theologian arguing for a restructuring of church authority. He was a bishop and a scholar doing what careful readers do, following the logic of the text to its most accurate description. He did not write it as a provocation. He wrote it as an observation. That matters more than it might seem, because it tells us that in the 3rd century, within the tradition that would become Orthodox, Catholic Christianity, the idea of Mary Magdalene as a figure of apostolic witness was not considered dangerous or strange. It was considered an honest reading of what the Gospel actually said. Other writers in the same tradition carried that reading forward in their own ways. Augustine of Hippo, in the 5th century, described Mary Magdalene in his sermons on the Gospel of John as the one sent to the apostles with the news of the resurrection, the one present when they were absent, the one commissioned to carry what she alone had seen. Whether he used the exact Latin phrase or expressed the same understanding in different words, the theological substance was consistent. The Gospels had placed her there. The tradition recognized what that placement meant. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, was more direct. In his Gospel commentaries, he used the phrase apostolorum apostola when discussing the resurrection accounts, and he did so without any sense that he was making an unusual or controversial claim. For Aquinas, as for Hippolytus before him, it was simply the accurate description of what the text described. These 3 men read the same gospel in different centuries and arrived at the same conclusion independently. That is not a chain of tradition passing a phrase from one hand to the next. That is 3 careful readers, separated by 1,000 years of history, finding the same thing in the same text, because the text put it there. The title was not invented by modern scholars trying to rehabilitate a figure who had been wronged. It was not created by theologians in the 20th century looking for ancient support for contemporary arguments. It was created, again and again, by men who were at the center of the very institution that the 20th century would later feel the need to correct. They created it because the text gave them no other honest option. So here is the question that this history forces. If writers inside the Orthodox tradition were using this language from the 3rd century onward, if the title never disappeared from the theological literature, if it was there for anyone who went looking, then why did most people in the Christian world spend so much of its history with no idea it existed? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary than that, and in some ways, more interesting. It is a story about what happens when a tradition holds 2 things at the same time and gradually, without any single decisive moment, allows one of them to become so much louder than the other that the quieter one can no longer be heard. The title Apostola Apostolorum never disappeared from the theological literature. It was always there. But theological literature and popular religious imagination are 2 very different things. What a bishop writes in a commentary, and what a congregation is told on a Sunday morning, and what an artist paints on a chapel wall, and what a child is taught in a school or a home. These things do not always carry the same content. They rarely do. 2. By the time the tradition had fully formed its image of Mary Magdalene in the minds of ordinary believers, that image had very little to do with the woman standing outside the tomb, being told to go and tell. It had much more to do with something that happened on a Sunday morning in Rome in the year 591. In a sermon delivered by a man who had no idea what he was setting in motion. We will come to that moment. But before we do, there is one more date worth holding. July 22nd, 2016. Pope Francis issued a decree elevating the feast of Mary Magdalene in the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar. She had been commemorated on that date for centuries. What changed was the level of that commemoration. She was raised from a memorial to a feast, the same liturgical rank given to the apostles themselves. The Vatican document explaining that decision used specific language. Apostolorum apostola. The phrase that Hippolytus had reflected on in the 3rd century, that Augustine had echoed in the 5th, that Aquinas had used in the 13th, that had lived in the theological literature without ever quite reaching the people sitting in the pews, appeared in an official Vatican decree as the reason a pope was changing the liturgical calendar. It had taken 1700 years to travel from the page of a commentary to the language of an official church document. Not because it was ever forbidden, not because anyone had decided it was wrong, but because another story had been told so many times, for so many centuries, so completely, that this one had been drowned out. That other story begins in the next chapter, and it begins with a decision made on a Sunday morning that changed everything. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Was 3 Women. Rome, September 21st, 591. A Sunday morning. A church full of people who have come, as people in this city have come for generations, to hear the bishop speak. The bishop is Gregory. He will later be called Gregory the Great, one of the most consequential figures in the history of the Western Church. A man whose decisions about theology and liturgy and church administration will shape Catholic Christianity for centuries after his death. He is not yet great this morning. He is simply the Bishop of Rome, standing in front of his congregation, reading from the Gospel of Luke. The passage is from chapter 7. A woman enters the house where Jesus is eating with a Pharisee. She is not named. The text calls her only a sinner. She kneels at his feet. She weeps. She wipes his feet with her hair and anoints them with oil from an alabaster jar. Gregory begins his sermon. And in the course of that sermon, he does something whose consequences no one in the room could have predicted. He makes an identification. The unnamed sinful woman in Luke chapter 7. Gregory tells his congregation, is Mary Magdalene, the woman mentioned just one chapter later as someone from whom 7 demons had been driven out. He goes further. Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, the woman who sat at Jesus' feet while her sister worked and who anointed him before his death. She is also Mary Magdalene. 3 women, 3 separate figures appearing in different passages, living in different places, described in different circumstances. Gregory looks at all 3 and sees one. He is not inventing this from nothing. The tendency to identify these figures with one another had appeared in earlier interpretation, and Gregory is working within a tradition of reading that had been developing for some time. But Gregory is the Bishop of Rome. He is the most powerful single voice in Western Christianity. And when he makes this identification from a pulpit in the capital of what remains of the Roman world, it moves from being one interpretive possibility, among others, to being, for most ordinary believers, simply true. It will remain true in the popular imagination of the Western Church for 1400 years. The important question is not simply whether the identification holds up to scrutiny. Modern scholarship has examined the 3 figures carefully and concluded that the Gospel texts do not support reading them as the same person. The unnamed woman in Luke 7 is not identified as Mary Magdalene anywhere in the narrative. Mary of Bethany appears in her own distinct context with her own family and her own story. The identification Gregory made is not what the texts describe. But the more important question is why Gregory made it. What was he trying to do? And here, the answer requires honesty about the world Gregory was working in. Rome, in 591, is not a stable place. The city has been suffering through a devastating plague for years. The same plague that killed Gregory's predecessor, and that Gregory himself believes may be a sign of approaching divine judgment. The Church is trying to hold together a fractured world. Gregory is a man of extraordinary pastoral gifts, and he understands, in a way that purely academic thinkers often do not, that a church is not just a set of doctrines, it is a community of human beings who need stories they can live inside. The story Gregory builds around Mary Magdalene is powerful precisely because it is human in the most recognizable way. A woman who had lived outside the boundaries of what her world considered righteous. A woman who came, in her brokenness, to the one place where she was not turned away, and who left, transformed. That is not a story about Mary Magdalene, the witness. It is not a story about apostolic authority or resurrection testimony, or the sequence of who was sent to tell whom what they had seen. It is a story about the possibility of return, about the mercy available to the most compromised human being, about the idea that the distance between where you are and where grace can reach you is not as great as it looks from inside your own life. For the people sitting in that church in Rome in 591, many of them frightened, many of them grieving, many of them carrying things they had done that they could not undo. That story is not a distortion of what the gospel means. It is one of the things the gospel means, arriving in the form they most needed it. This is the thing that is easy to lose sight of when we look back at Gregory from a distance of 14 centuries. He was not primarily making a historical claim. He was making a pastoral one. He was giving his congregation a Mary they could find themselves in. A Mary who had been where they were, who had done what they feared they had done, and who had been found and welcomed back anyway. The problem is not that this Mary was emotionally powerful. The problem is that she was so emotionally powerful that she gradually became the only Mary most people could see. The Mary who stood outside the tomb and was told to go and tell did not disappear from the texts. She was still there, in the Gospel of John, in exactly the same place she had always been. But, in the imagination of the tradition, in the paintings and the sermons and the stories that ordinary people encountered across the centuries that followed, she became harder and harder to reach. Because the penitent Mary was so vivid, so human, so necessary to so many people in so many different circumstances, across so many different centuries. Gregory did not set out to displace one Mary with another. He set out to comfort his congregation on a Sunday morning during a plague. What he could not have known, and what no one standing in that church could have known, was that the story he told that morning would travel so far and last so long that it would become, for most of the Christian world, the whole of what Mary Magdalene meant. He did not erase her. He transformed her. And the transformation was so complete, so emotionally necessary to so many people for so long, that it would take 14 centuries and a formal decree from Rome to begin to see through it. Not because anyone was hiding the other Mary. Not because the tradition made a decision to suppress what the Gospels had placed at the center, but because the story Gregory told that morning was simply told more often, more loudly, and to more people, for 1400 years. And a story told that way does not need a conspiracy to prevail. It only needs time. Chapter 4. The Other Gospel. Go back to Berlin. Go back to that manuscript, sitting in a research institute, waiting through 2 world wars and the slow, exhausted peace that followed them. We left it there at the beginning of this video because we needed to understand something first. We needed to understand that Mary Magdalene did not need another gospel to matter. She was already at the center of the story the tradition chose to keep. We needed to understand that the title the tradition gave her was not a modern invention, but an honest description of something the texts had always contained. We needed to understand how a single sermon on a single Sunday morning could reshape the imagination of an entire civilization. Now we can go back to the manuscript, because what is inside it makes a different kind of sense when you come to it with all of that already in hand. The text, published in 1955 from Papyrus Barrelinensis 8502, is known today as the Gospel of Mary. It is not one of the 4 canonical Gospels. It was not included in the New Testament. It belongs to a stream of early Christian writing that developed alongside the tradition that would eventually become Orthodox Christianity, sometimes in conversation with it, sometimes in tension with it, always asking some of the same questions from a different angle. The manuscript is incomplete. Pages are missing from the middle. The most frustrating kind of loss. The kind where you can see what came before and what came after, but the center, where the argument reaches its peak, is simply gone. No one knows where those pages are. No one knows when they disappeared. They were gone before Karl Reinhardt bought the manuscript in Cairo in 1896. And they have not been found since. What remains is enough to understand what the text was doing. It opens after the resurrection. The disciples are gathered together, frightened and uncertain. They are asking the question that people who have just lost someone always ask. In one form or another, what do we do now? The one who made sense of everything is gone. How do we continue without him? Mary speaks. She does not offer comfort in the way the other disciples seem to expect. She stands up. In a room full of people who have been with Jesus as long as she has. And she redirects their grief towards something more than itself. She reminds them of what they were given and what they were asked to do with it. She does not wait for permission. She leads. Peter turns to her. And what he says next is striking. He asks her to tell them what Jesus said to her privately. Things Peter acknowledges that the rest of them do not know. Things shared with her and not with them. Think about what that acknowledgement contains. Even here, in a text that did not make it into the New Testament, in a community whose understanding of authority was clearly different from the one that prevailed. The memory of Mary having a particular kind of access was real enough that Peter himself was the one asking her to share it. She tells them about a vision she received. The content of the vision is philosophical and concerned with questions about the soul and perception and the nature of what can be truly known. It is not what most people expect when they hear that a gospel carries Mary Magdalene's name. And then the pages run out. The center of the argument is missing. When the text resumes, something has shifted. Andrew speaks first. He finds what Mary described difficult to recognize. Then Peter speaks. And what Peter says is not about the content of the vision at all. He asks about Mary herself. Did the teacher really speak privately with a woman? Did he prefer her to us? A disciple named Levi answers him. And Levi's answer is direct in a way that few early texts allow themselves to be. If the teacher found her worthy, Levi says, "Who are you to reject her?" The text ends there. No resolution. No declared winner. The argument simply stops. The way arguments in real life so often stop. Not because they have been settled, but because the writing runs out. Now, here is how not to read this text. Do not read it as evidence of a romantic relationship between Mary and Jesus. That reading has circulated widely for decades, and it is not what the text is doing. The Gospel of Mary is not interested in romance. It is interested in a much older question. Who gets to know things? What counts as legitimate understanding? And where can legitimate understanding come from? Do not read it as direct evidence about Mary Magdalene as a historical person. This text was not written by someone who knew her. It was written by a community, most likely in the 2nd century, that was working through its own questions about authority and revelation and knowledge, and was using her name and her image to give those questions a human face. That is not a lesser use of the text. It is actually the more honest way to read it. Because what the Gospel of Mary shows us is not the woman who stood outside the tomb in the 1st century. It shows us something different, and in its own way, something more verifiable. It shows us a community of early Christians who remembered her in a specific way, who placed her at the center of an argument about who gets to speak when no one knows what to say next, who made her the figure through whom the deepest questions about faith and authority could be asked most directly. They did not invent the idea that she had a particular kind of access. That idea was already present in the canonical Gospels. What this text did was take that idea and push it further. Develop it. Use it to ask questions. The canonical tradition was not asking in the same way. And the argument inside the text, the one between Peter and Levi about whether Mary's witness should be trusted, is not simply a literary device. It is a window into something real. It is a window into questions that early Christian communities were genuinely living with. Questions about who gets to speak, whose experience counts as evidence, whether understanding can arrive through a channel that the community has not officially recognized, questions that did not begin with this manuscript. And, question, as we are about to see, that did not end with it either. Chapter 5. Peter and Mary. There is a tension woven into the earliest Christian texts that almost no one discusses directly. Not because it is obscure. It is sitting in plain view. In the canonical Gospels, in the letters of Paul, in the manuscript we just read, and in half a dozen others, it is one of the most consistent threads running through the entire earliest layer of Christian writing. It is the tension between two kinds of authority. And the tradition gave it two faces. One of them is Peter. Peter is the rock, the one Jesus names as the foundation of the church in the Gospel of Matthew. The leader of the Jerusalem community in the years after the crucifixion, the figure whose name appears first in nearly every list of disciples across the canonical tradition. When the church needed a human symbol for the authority that passes from one generation to the next through an unbroken chain of recognized leaders, Peter was the face it reached for. The other face is Mary. Not because anyone planned it that way. Not because some early Christian council sat down and decided to make her the symbol of something, but because the texts kept placing her in a specific position. The position of someone who knew something directly, who had seen something personally, whose understanding did not arrive through a chain of transmission, but through an encounter that happened to her and to no one else in quite the same way. She was at the tomb when Peter was not. She was told to go and tell when Peter had already gone home. She received, according to multiple texts from multiple different communities, something the others had not received in the same form. And so, without anyone deciding it, she became the face of a different kind of authority, not the authority of institution and succession and recognized office, the authority of direct encounter, of experience that does not require an intermediary to validate it, of the understanding that arrives not through a chain of teaching but through the thing itself. These two kinds of authority are not naturally at peace with each other. The authority of institution depends on order, on recognized channels, on the idea that what someone claims to know must be verifiable through a community with the standing to verify it. It is the authority that builds churches and carries traditions across centuries and keeps a community from dissolving into 1,000 contradictory private revelations. Without it, nothing holds together long enough to matter. The authority of direct experience depends on something harder to organize, on the idea that the divine does not restrict itself to approved channels or recognized offices or people with the right credentials, It is the authority that produces the mystic who insists on the reality of what she has seen. The reformer who cannot stop pointing at the gap between what the institution says and what the institution does. The ordinary person who knows, in a way they cannot fully explain, that something is true. Both of these authorities appear in the earliest Christian texts. Both were present in the tradition from the beginning. And the tension between them did not resolve cleanly in the 1st century or the 2nd or the 3rd. It simply put on different clothes as the centuries moved. Consider Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century Germany, a woman living inside a religious institution, subject to the authority of abbots and bishops and a church hierarchy that was entirely male. And yet, Hildegard wrote theology, composed music, traveled to preach, corresponded with popes and emperors, and did all of it on the basis of a single claim that the institution could not easily process. She had seen things directly. She was not claiming the authority of office. She was not claiming the authority of learning, though she was extraordinarily learned. She was claiming something older and harder to argue with, that she had received something, and that what she had received was real, and that the reality of what she had received did not require the institution's approval to be true. The institution accommodated her. It did not always know what to do with her. It recognized her gifts and simultaneously tried to contain them. She lived inside that tension for decades, and what she produced inside it has lasted for 900 years. That is the tension that the Gospel of Mary puts a face on. Not Hildegard's face, Mary's face, but the same tension, appearing in a text from the 2nd century, and in the life of a woman in the 12th, and in arguments that Christianity is still having in the 21st. Now come back to Peter's question in the Gospel of Mary. Did the teacher really speak privately with a woman? That question is not about romance. It is not even, at its deepest level, about gender. It is about legitimacy, about whether an experience that arrived outside the recognized channels, outside the group, outside the shared encounter that the community can collectively verify, should count as the basis for authority. Peter is asking, how do we know? And Levi's answer does not resolve the epistemological problem. Levi says, if the teacher found her worthy, who are you to reject her? That is an argument from character and prior relationship, not from verifiable evidence. It is the kind of answer that satisfies people who already trust Mary and frustrates people who need a more systematic basis for trust. The text does not declare a winner. It ends. And in some sense, it is still ending. The question Peter asked has not been answered in any form that everyone accepts. The tension between the authority of institution and the authority of direct encounter, it is a condition that the tradition has learned to live with, sometimes gracefully and sometimes not, by finding different equilibria in different centuries, without ever eliminating the underlying question. Mary Magdalene is not the origin of that tension. It was there before her, and it will be there long after. But in the earliest texts, the texts that were being written and read and argued over in the communities that were still deciding what Christianity was going to be, that tension was given her face. Because the story of what happened at the tomb, the story the tradition, preserved in its own canonical Gospels, had already placed her in the position that made the tension unavoidable. She knew something the others did not know yet. She was sent to tell them. What do you do with that? If you are trying to build an institution that runs on the authority of Peter and his successors, you cannot erase her. She is in the text. What happens instead, without any single moment of deliberate choice, is that the story gets told in ways that gradually make her role harder to see. The title fades from the pulpit even as it persists in the commentary. The other story gets louder. The centuries do the quiet work that no single decision could have accomplished. And then, 1700 years later, a pope opens a decree and reaches for the phrase that had been waiting in the theological literature since the 3rd century. as if it had been there all along, because it had. Chapter 6. The Long Afterlife. A decision made on a Sunday morning in 591 did not stay in that church in Rome. It traveled. That is the nature of a story told by the right person at the right moment in history. It does not need to be enforced. It does not need guards or edicts or an institution actively maintaining it. It simply moves. The way any story that answers a genuine human need moves. Because people find it useful. Because it gives a shape to something they already feel. Because it hands them a way to understand their own lives. The image Gregory built around Mary Magdalene moved through the medieval world with a thoroughness that is difficult to overstate. Within the generations that followed his sermon, the identification he had made ceased to be one interpretive possibility among others. Artists working in stone and paint and glass did not frame their work as a commentary on Gregory's reading. They simply depicted Mary Magdalene the way everyone understood her to be. A woman with long unbound hair, an alabaster jar, a face turned downward, or turned upward, but always carrying the weight of something that had happened before this moment. The hair mattered more than most modern viewers realize. In the world that produced these images, unbound hair on a woman carried specific cultural meaning. It signaled mourning, penitence, a kind of exposure beyond the boundaries of ordinary social propriety. When medieval artists placed Mary Magdalene before them, they were encoding a complete theology, the beauty that had been offered wrongly, now offered rightly, the life that had been turned away from its source, now returned to it. And that theology carried something real. This is the thing that is easy to miss when looking back at this period with the knowledge that the image was built on a misidentification. The penitent Mary answered something genuine in the people who turned to her. The idea that the most broken person is not beyond reach. That the woman who came to the feet of Jesus carrying everything she had done was received and not sent away. That whatever she had been before that moment did not close the door on what she could become after it. These are not trivial consolations. They are among the most consequential ideas in the entire Christian tradition. And for generation after generation, Mary Magdalene was their human face. She was the proof that return was possible. In the 13th century, a collection of saints' lives known as the Legenda Aurea gave the penitent Mary a full biography that the Gospels had never provided. In this telling, after the resurrection, Mary Magdalene traveled to the south of France with a small group of companions. She preached. She converted people. She eventually withdrew to a cave in the hills above what is now the town of Saint-Maximin-la-Saint-Baume, where she lived as a hermit, sustained by angels who came to her 7 times each day. There is no historical basis for any of this. But the Legenda Aurea was one of the most widely read texts in medieval Europe, circulated in hundreds of manuscripts across the continent. The story of Mary Magdalene in Provence became as vivid to medieval Christians as the story of her at the tomb. Pilgrims made the journey to the cave. Churches rose in her name across France and beyond. A whole landscape of devotion gathered itself around a woman who had almost certainly never set foot in that country. The devotion was real, even if the history was not. The Renaissance took the penitent Mary and gave her some of the most powerful visual representations in Western art. Titian painted her multiple times. Each version, a meditation on the strange relationship between physical beauty and spiritual grief. A woman so present in her body and so absent from any comfort that the two things together create something almost unbearable to look at directly. Caravaggio gave her the face of someone who has just arrived at a realization she cannot take back. A young woman sitting alone with her jewels scattered around her, and her hands clasped, and her eyes looking at nothing visible in the room. Donatello carved her in wood, and what he made is almost shocking in its refusal to console. She is gaunt. She is hollow. Her hair wraps around her like the last garment of someone who has given everything else away. She does not look redeemed. She looks like someone who has survived something, and is not yet sure whether survival was the point. These are not sentimental images. The greatest of them are ferocious in their honesty about what it costs a human being to be broken and then found. They are also, every one of them, built on the figure that Gregory assembled in 591. A composite woman who never existed as a single historical person, held together by the authority of a sermon, covered by 14 centuries of accumulated art and devotion until the seams became invisible. The scholarly recognition that the identification Gregory made was not supported by the text was not a 20th century discovery. Critical readers had been raising the question for centuries before that. But the speed of scholarly recognition and the speed at which popular imagination changes are not the same speed. They rarely are. 1969 brought the first formal acknowledgement from the Roman Catholic Church in its liturgical documents. In the reforms that followed the Second Vatican Council, Mary Magdalene was officially distinguished from Mary of Bethany and from the unnamed woman in Luke. The correction appeared as a quiet adjustment in a revised calendar. Most of the faithful did not notice. The image that Gregory had built was too deeply embedded in too many centuries of art and story and devotion to shift because of a change in a liturgical document. The official church had updated its position. The popular imagination had not. What was needed was something more visible. Something that named the title directly, rather than simply withdrawing the misidentification. In July of 2016, Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day, and the Vatican's explanatory document used the words Apostolorum Apostola, the title that had lived in the theological literature since the 3rd century, that had never been officially abandoned, but had never reached the people in the pews, was placed in the language of a formal decree as the reason for the elevation. It was not an apology for Gregory. It was not a declaration that 14 centuries of popular devotion had been built on a mistake. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more significant. It was the tradition reaching back past the sermon in 591, past the Legenda Aurea, past Titian and Caravaggio and Donatello, past all of the afterlife of Gregory's decision, and touching the text itself again. The woman at the tomb, the one told to go and tell. The long afterlife of the mistake had not erased that moment. It had buried it under 14 centuries of a different story. And now the question becomes what we do with both stories at once. With the penitent who answered something real in generation after generation of believers, and with the witness who was there first, on the most important morning, carrying news that no one else had yet received. Both of them are Mary. The question is, which one we have been willing to see. Chapter 7. 3 Portraits. No final answer. We have been traveling for a long time now. We started in a market in Cairo in 1896, with a fragile manuscript and a scholar who did not yet know what he was carrying. We moved backward into the Gospels themselves, into the early morning hours of the day that the tradition built everything else around. And we found a woman standing outside a tomb being told to go and tell. We traced the title that the tradition gave her and then gradually stopped saying out loud. We watched a single sermon become 14 centuries of a different story. We read a manuscript that asked, in the middle of its missing pages, who gets to know things and who gets to say so? Now we need to do something harder. We need to put 3 images on the table and look at all of them at once, without deciding in advance which one is the real Mary and which ones are errors to be corrected. Because that framing is not quite right. And the right question is harder to sit with. The first image. A woman standing outside a tomb in the early morning. She has been there since before dawn. The others have come and gone. She stays. She is crying. And she does not yet understand what she is standing at the edge of. A voice calls her name. She turns. She is told to go and tell. This is the Mary of the canonical Gospels. The Mary of the text that the tradition itself chose to preserve and to place at the center of everything. She is not a peripheral figure in this story. She is the first witness to the event the entire tradition is built around. She is sent before the apostles are sent. She carries the news that makes everything else possible. This is the Mary that writers inside the Orthodox tradition described from the 3rd century onward. The Mary that Pope Francis named in a formal decree in 2016. She has never left the text. She has never needed to be discovered or recovered. The question has always been simply how clearly the tradition was willing to say her name. The second image. A woman standing in a room full of frightened people, speaking when no one else knows what to say. A vision received. A philosophical argument about the nature of the soul and what it means to truly know something. A challenge from Peter. A defense from Levi. Missing pages where the center of the argument should be. This is the Mary of the Gospel of Mary and the texts that gathered around it. She is not the Mary of history. She is the Mary of a community's memory, shaped by that community's own pressing questions. Given the face of the woman at the tomb, because her face was the one that fit the argument being made. She tells us nothing certain about who Mary Magdalene was as a person in the 1st century. But she tells us something very certain about what some early Christians needed her to be. They needed her to be the one who understood when others were still uncertain. The one whose authority came from encounter rather than from office. The one who could be challenged and defended and still, even in the middle of the argument, remain the person the others turned to when they did not know what to do next. That is not a fabrication. That is a community working out its deepest questions about faith and knowledge and authority, and choosing her face to work them out through, because her face already carried the weight of what she had witnessed. Because the canonical tradition had placed her at the center of the moment, everything turned on. And because the questions the community was asking needed a face with that kind of gravity behind it. The third image. A woman with long unbound hair and an alabaster jar. Titian's study in beauty and grief. Caravaggio's figure of private reckoning. Donatello's gaunt and hollow survivor. The woman in 1,000 illuminated manuscripts and stone carvings in chapels across Europe. The woman whose legend placed her in a cave in Provence for 30 years. Stripped of everything. Lifted by angels into the music of heaven. This is the Mary of Gregory's decision, and the medieval imagination, and the Legenda Aurea and 14 centuries of accumulated art and devotion. She is, historically speaking, a composite, built from 3 separate figures in the gospel text, held together by the authority of a sermon, covered by centuries of retelling until the seams became invisible. She is not what the texts describe, but she is what millions of human beings across 14 centuries found in the tradition when they needed to find that return was possible. That the most broken person is not beyond reach. That whatever has been done cannot close every door. For generation after generation. She was the proof of that. And the proof was not false, simply because the history was imprecise. The need she answered was real. The faith she sustained was real. The comfort she provided in churches and cathedrals and private moments of grief and shame across 14 centuries was real. Now hold all 3 of those images at the same time. The witness, the companion, the penitent, and notice something. All 3 of them were necessary to someone. All 3 answered a question that someone was genuinely asking. All 3 carried something true, even when they were not carrying the same truth. Even when they contradicted each other. Even when one of them was built on a misidentification that took 1,400 years to formally acknowledge. The witness answered the question of who was there and what it meant. The companion answered the question of who gets to know and who gets to say so. The penitent answered the question of whether anyone is too far gone to be reached. 3 questions. 3 faces of the same woman. 3 things a tradition needed across 2,000 years of trying to understand what it believed. Now, go back to Joanna. Go back to Salome. Go back to the other women with them. The ones Luke names, and then does not name, The ones who were present at the most important mourning in the tradition's history, and whom the tradition did not find a way to carry. Here is what sits uncomfortably alongside everything else we have looked at today. We have spent this entire video recovering Mary Magdalene, tracing her from the Gospels to the Church Fathers, to the manuscript in Berlin, to the sermon in Rome, to the decree in 2016. We have argued, carefully and with evidence, that she belongs at the center of the story, that the text places her there, that the tradition itself, at its best moments, recognized what the text was saying. And all of that is true. But in the act of recovering her, in the act of placing her back at the center, we have done to Joanna and Salome and the unnamed others exactly what the tradition did to them the first time. We have passed over them. We have chosen one woman to remember and allowed the rest to remain where they have always been, in the margins, named once or twice and then released back into silence. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about the limits of what recovery can accomplish. Memory does not work without selection. Attention cannot hold everything at once. A story can only follow one thread at a time. And the thread we have followed is the one the tradition made most visible. Which means that even our attempt at correction is shaped by the same forces that created what we are trying to correct. Joanna was there. Salome was there. The other women were there. And they are still waiting for someone to follow their thread. Which brings us, finally, to the question underneath all three portraits. Every age that encountered Mary Magdalene felt the need to decide what kind of woman she was. The 1st century made her a witness. The 2nd and 3rd centuries made her a companion and a figure in an argument about who gets to know things. The 7th century made her a penitent. The 21st century is in the middle of making her into something else again. A recovered figure. A corrected record. A woman finally seen clearly after 2,000 years of distortion. But maybe the most honest thing to say is this. Every age remembers her the way it needs to. Not the way she was. The way it needs. That is not a criticism of any particular age. It is a description of how memory works. Religious memory. Historical memory. The memory of anyone who mattered enough that people kept arguing about her long after she was gone. What we call recovery is also a form of need. What we call correction is also a form of portrait. We are not the first people to believe we are finally seeing her clearly. She was never forgotten. Every age held on to her. The penitent. The witness. The companion. The subject of papal decrees and missing manuscripts and sermons during a plague. Each of these is a form of being held. The question that remains, the one that no portrait fully answers, is whether any of us, in any century, have actually remembered her, or whether we have been, all along, remembering ourselves. Take that question wherever it leads you. Because a woman placed at the center of the most important mourning in a tradition's entire history, then transformed, then argued over, then partially recovered, then argued over again, is not finished being remembered. And neither are we.